Go ahead and get started here. I'm John Anderson. I'm a principal consultant here at Networks to Code. Also, as Jeremy Stretch mentioned, the beginning of the day, a few years ago, I joined on as a maintainer of NetBox. We're going to be going over some extensibility options within NetBox today. So we're going to start, with just an overview of what that landscape looks like, and then talk about some specific use cases and options that you have for making use of some of these features. So what do I mean by extensibility in NetBox? These are core features that are built into NetBox itself that allow you as the user to enhance the way that you use NetBox. So these are the features that allow you to integrate it with other tooling, with particular workflows that you have already in your organization. And in terms of network automation, when we start to build out, specific workflows for network automation, a lot of these features become real necessities for doing those sorts of things. And so when you start talking about these sorts of features, these are some that I've laid out here. These are mostly, this is most of the extensibility features within NetBox. It's not all of them, but kind of here's the high points here. And when we start talking about these features, a lot of people ask, do I need to be a software developer to make use of these features? And in reality, each of these features falls somewhere within a range of that skill set. We've got some features that you can go into your NetBox instance today, take 5 minutes, enable them for different use cases, and you're off to the races. And then other things, get down to the side of the plugins framework. Those are APIs built specifically for developers to extend NetBox in a much more rigid fashion. So we'll start off with our NAPALM integration. So NAPALM, if you're unfamiliar with it, is an open source Python library for abstracting communication with network devices in a vendor agnostic manner. And specifically in NetBox, we have an integration where you can, if you choose to make use of it, you can pull environmental and status information. You can pull the running configuration off a device and view that in NetBox. I think one of the under publicized features of NetBox, two of them I've got listed here, is this interface connection LLDP neighbors feature. And so as many of you existing NetBox users may know, you have the ability in NetBox to model interface connections between devices. Well, if you choose to use NAPALM and you're running LLDP within your network, you can actually use NAPALM to pull that information off of devices and do an audit against those configurations, against those connections, interface connections that you have defined within NetBox. So if you've got a connection between two devices and LLDP agrees on that, then that'll show up green in that view. And if LLDP returns something that you didn't have configured in NetBox, that'll show up in red. So just kind of a neat convenience feature that we have built into NetBox. And another one that people don't often realize is that we actually expose this feature in NetBox's REST API. And what that means is for certain use cases, you can actually use NetBox as an API proxy for the NAPALM library. So if you wanted to, instead of having to use NAPALM directly in your own Python code, you could use NetBox's API to do certain things with NAPALM. And in particular, we expose the get methods, which is retrieving data from a device. If you want to make use of this feature, all you have to do is pip install NAPALM in the same runtime environment that you've got NetBox running in. And then you need to add a couple of configuration parameters to your NetBox configuration. There are more than just those two available for different use cases within NAPALM, but to get started, you just need your credentials to connect to the device. Then the next thing that you'll have to do is create a platform, or if you have an existing one, you just go in and edit it. But what we're going to do is define the NAPALM driver associated with that platform, and that tells NAPALM what is the type of device, so that it knows how to talk to that device. And then we're going to assign that platform to a device that we have defined in NetBox. And then also importantly, we need to make sure that we have a primary IP address assigned to that device so that NetBox obviously knows how to communicate with it. Once you've got that, if it's all done correctly, some of those tabs that you may have seen on the device view here that may have been grayed out before, like the status, the LLDP neighbors, and the configuration tabs actually become active and you can use them. That's because those tabs are pulling data from NAPALM live off the network. Now, it is also important to note that NetBox is in no way storing this information that it's pulling from NAPALM. That's not our intent. That's not a feature set that NetBox wants to play with. in terms of the monitoring space. We're pulling this information live as you request it. And as I mentioned, the REST API proxy here. So, here's another method, the get ARP table method that NAPALM supports, just using that within the NetBox API. Next feature, another very popular one that a lot of people wind up using is custom fields. And so what these are they equate to database fields that you as the user get to define, and you add them to certain models within NetBox. So the reason you would do this is maybe you have a use case in your organization where you need to store some particular bit of information on every single device, like purchase order agreements or something like that. So you can bridge the gap between your use case and perhaps the fact that that use case isn't ubiquitous enough within the NetBox community that those types of fields are not already included on the models. And we have the data types that you might expect here. You can do text fields, integers, booleans. We do URLs, and then selections are like drop-down menus. And another question that often also comes up is feature parity. So anything you can do with custom fields in the UI, you can also do in the API. So you can read and write custom field data just as you would in the UI. So they are first-class citizens in both cases. If you want to create a custom field, this is done through the NetBox admin portal. And the way you do that is if you're logged into NetBox, in the standard front-end view, your user information is up in the top right. If you click on that, there's a link to the admin panel, provided you have the proper privileges to access that area of NetBox. And from there, you'll be able to create custom fields. And what we do here is we assign the particular object type or types that you want this particular field to relate to. So in this case, we're adding a field called monitored, which would be a true-false Boolean field to the device model. And once that's been created, as you might expect, on the forms where we create or edit existing devices, those custom fields show up, and we can modify that data. And then obviously in the object views, like in the device, in this case, we can see that data that we've set. And then just on the right, just driving home that point again that custom fields are, first-class citizens within our REST API. Next feature, a couple of presenters have already touched on this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but custom links. So these are dynamically generated buttons that actually show up in the top right of different object views. And these are templated links so that you're using data defined in each object to create a link on the fly. And the use case for this is so that you can link your NetBox data directly to other systems that you might be running in your ecosystem. So, Jeremy Schulman this morning showed an excellent use case where he's actually got a button that'll link directly to the backed up configuration for a given device. And the way that we do that is, again, in the admin portal, we'll create a custom link here and we'll tie it to the particular model or object type that we care about. And then we do this with Jinja 2. So Jinja 2, if you've ever done anything with Ansible, it's that same templating language. If you're unfamiliar with these concepts, basically what we're doing is what we call variable replacement. So we're defining some variable that it will be dynamically populated when this link goes to be rendered on the page. In this case, we want the object's name, in this case, the device's name, as a part of that link. And so those show up in the top right here, like we've got one for this NMS access switch here, and I've got another one here for paging, just so you can see that you can do multiple. And the point there is you can also optionally group them if you have a use case for doing something like that. Webhooks, another very popular feature in terms of automation, and has been talked about several times today already. But here we'll solidify it a little bit more here, maybe for some people. So webhooks rely on event data within NetBox. And so what we're doing is we're publishing events that occur in NetBox to external systems. So this is NetBox sending data somewhere else. And so we trigger these on object create, update, or delete events. And those are the three different types, and you can choose to use all three or just one or a combination for a particular webhook that you define. So if you only want a webhook, to fire when a device is deleted, so you have like a deprovisioning automation workflow, you can set that up. So again, this is great for updating or notifying other systems that you might have in your automation ecosystem when events are happening live in NetBox. Now, of course, it's important to know that you could achieve the same sort of thing that we're doing with webhooks with the REST API if you just pulled NetBox every so often. And it is important to consider cases where you would or would not want to use either of those two methods. So if you had a webhook set up to, notify some system when you create, every time you create an IP address, if you're doing, thousands and thousands and thousands of those every day, and the system that you're sending those webhooks to can't keep up with that, then that might not be the proper use case for using a webhook. So it's important to consider that in the particular use case that you're working with. But again, on the flip side, webhooks are live event data. So if you want more real-time notification of events, that's potentially the way that you want to go. And like with the other features, we're going to create those in the admin portal. So here, we're just tying that to the particular object type or types that we want. And then you have the event types that you want to tie to. And then down here, we have some additional properties like the URL that we're actually going to send the request to, the HTTP method. So if you want to send a post body, if you just want to make a GET request to somewhere else, you can do that. And earlier in the day, Jeremy Stretch also alluded to a fact that in a not too distant ago release, this is a relatively recent feature, you have the ability now to template out your own request body. So before, when we first implemented webhooks, we had a standard request body, and what that means is that that's the data that the webhook is sending to another system. And so the way that the object was represented was very similar to the way it looked in the API. But now you have the ability, you have that data dictionary, you can define your own template, so you can define your own request body. If you choose not to do that, it'll still use that old system, so it's backwards compatible in that manner. You don't have to do this, but for use cases where you just want, a very specific request body sent, you can do that. And that's useful in certain situations where before it might have been necessary to send webhooks to a middleware service that would receive that and then talk to an intermediary to get to the final system that you're trying to do automation with. In this particular case, in certain use cases, you can actually talk directly from NetBox to that end system here. Export templates. This is another really cool feature. This is more UI driven today, but we do have plans to eventually in the future be able to do export templates from the API. But basically what this is you have a filtered list of objects and you define a template for creating different representations of that data. So this is great if you want to do custom CSV export templates where you have custom headers defined or manipulation of the data within that CSV report, or you want to generate like a Nagios configuration. You can actually do that natively in here just by defining the structure of the configuration file and so forth. Again, we do that in the admin portal, and this is once more just Jinja 2 templating. So in this case, we're creating an export template for a custom CSV file, and you have the option to specify a MIME type and a file extension, because what we're actually doing is in the UI, in the upper right of the list view where you do your filtering for what objects you want to act upon, you have the export button, and you're going to download a file basically from that. And like I mentioned, this is UI driven today, but we do have plans to implement this in the API at some point in the future. So, and this, of course, on the right-hand side is just an example of the output of that particular export template. The REST API. So, this is potentially, considered like the bread and butter of network automation use cases. So this is how, we programmatically interact with NetBox from other places within our ecosystem. So we can read and write data to and from NetBox. Our API since version 2.0, which was several years ago now, does support write operations. So you can, do most of all of the things that you can do in the UI with the API now. We have several client libraries available. Some people have touched on those, and I've got a slide with some links to a few here in a moment. Or if you choose, you can just use raw HTTP calls. Your choice. It's up to you. So we do have a browsable API. So if you're in the UI and you just want to see like, hey, what does the API representation of this object look like? What you can typically do is actually just in the first part of the URL, just prepend /API. to it, and that'll take you to the browsable API, and this is what the response would look like, if you were using the actual API. We do have a Swagger UI available at /API/docs. And if you've never used Swagger, that is a way for modeling and representing API specifications within the Open API spec. And it is a way that actually clients can dynamically consume the API and generate a client on their own. This is definitely a bit more of a more advanced use case, but that is an option. But the Swagger API is very useful, if you're wanting to get started with the API and start playing around with things. We do have some REST API clients, like I mentioned. So NetBox, easily the most popular. It's a Python SDK library available there under the DigitalOcean organization. And then if you are a Go programmer, we do have a Go NetBox community maintained library as well. And also worth noting, the API does have authentication mechanisms and does tie into the formal authorization schemes within, the same with the UI in NetBox. So that shouldn't be a concern for most people. Reports is the next feature. So this, if you remember back to that first slide with the arrow in terms of the scale by which these features fall into in terms of skill set, reports definitely does, step up a bit in terms of skill set needed to operate reports. But we've tried to expose the API in such a way that most people, even if you've never touched Python before, you should be able to look at someone else's report or some of the example reports that we have exposed and be able to kind of fumble your way through and figure out what you want to do. But basically, the premise of a report is you're going to loop through some data in NetBox that you choose, and you're going to do data validation with it. And so we have the capability to log success and failures of objects against the validation that you define. And so our API, provides boilerplate that you're going to define what's called a Python class in it, and it has a method that you put your business logic in, and that's the Python script that you write that'll do this validation. So here's a very simple example of a report that we have here, and what this is doing is validating that device host names conform to our naming convention that we've defined here, which is just, excuse me, this regular expression here saying, this report happens to be hard-coded to devices that exist in the site LAX. So we want to make sure that our host names conform to the naming convention for that. And so if they do pass, we log a success. If they don't, then we log a failure for that particular device. And we'll get to see that in the UI here when we actually execute that report. We get 3 devices at that site passed the validation, 1 failed, and we got that error message. We can see, obviously why that failed, because it does not conform to that standard. Reports can also be executed from the API. So if you have a report definition, there's a specific API endpoint for it, and you can get those results through the API. Custom scripts. So kind of in line with the concept of reports, we have custom scripts. So they're similar to reports, except that they accept user input. And the idea here is that not only could you do data validation with custom scripts, and I have an example of that here in a moment, but you can also manipulate data in NetBox. So it's a way to take business logic that you might have already defined somewhere, maybe some external tooling to NetBox where you're using the API today. You can actually bring that into NetBox in the form of a script. And that's actually sort of overlooked, but a really powerful benefit, because it means you don't have to maintain the infrastructure related to that additional tooling in a lot of cases. Certainly you have to maintain the code that you've written in the script, but it's sitting on top of the NetBox platform at that point. So you get a UI, you get the authentication around NetBox related to that for free. So in this case, this is a script. Obviously this is a bit more code than we had in the report, but what we're doing here is we've defined 2 variables. And the variables determine what the form renders to for the user to input data in the web form. So we want to ask the user for the name of a site that they want to create and how many access switches they want to create. So you can see what we're doing here is we're provisioning like a new branch within our organization. And this is a really powerful use case because, if you imagine like you're a retail organization that has hundreds and hundreds of branch sites, typically, in modern networks, those branches typically look very similar in terms of their network architecture. So we can actually script out the creation of those topologies in this way and ensure, that they're created the same way every time. But also, it's a great time savings for people in terms of using NetBox. So in the hundreds of clicks it may have taken to create all of those devices within a site or so forth, depending on the size of the branch, can be just a few clicks with a script. And then in this run method, just the same as the report, is where we actually implement that logic. So we create a site object, and then we loop through, how many devices we want to create and create those and assign those to our site. And here's what that looks like in the UI. So we have this web form here where we gave it the name of a site, the switch count, and we're going to run that script. And then obviously, for those input types, just like, with the custom fields, we have specific types of input data types that we support. And all the ones that you would expect are there. Notably, you can also reference existing data within NetBox. And that's, with our API select widget. So, if you've got a whole bunch of devices, you can search for them. And it uses the API to filter those down for you. You can also load files in. So like if you've got some YAML definitions or something, if you want to read and write from files, you can do that. And we also have specific input types for IPAM, related objects, IP addresses, IP prefixes, and so forth. Because this is NetBox, that's what we do. So that script is actually run inside of an atomic database transaction. So you have the ability to do like a dry run. So you can see what that script would do without actually making modifications to the database, which is really powerful for, people that in your teams that might be hesitant about certain types of automation, especially, if you've tied in other forms of automation to the creation of objects in NetBox. Give them an opportunity to see what is the script about to do before it goes and does it and might actually touch the real network. And then scripts do offer the same sort of logging features that the reports do. So you can actually do the same thing. So this is that report that we created before that does the name validation against our naming standard and actually running it as a script. So if you remember before, I had that hard-coded for LAX. We could actually set this up to ask the user to select a site. And so that's what this is, defining the query set for the sites, and you'll be able to select which site you want to run this against. And it's just the same sort of logic here. So I select the site LAX and I run, that same report logic, but in a custom script. So it's just a different mechanism. And the reason this is because reports existed before custom scripts did. That's why the features kind of overlap a little bit, but just know that the difference is that custom scripts allow for user input and are designed to do more than just data validation. They were intended to do manipulation and creation of data within NetBox. You can also, there's an output tab here. You can output raw data from the script. So if you wanted to have a script that took some input and then produced a CSV output from that, kind of like the export templates, but again, with user input, you can do that same sort of thing. The final feature I'll talk about here is the plugins framework, and it is definitely the kind of behemoth in terms of extensibility. This is a developer-centric toolkit. So to create effective plugins, you do need to have some level of skill set, within development abilities, software engineering. Certainly, knowledge of Django web framework with Python is certainly very helpful on this front. So the plugins framework launched as a part of v2.8, which was just a few weeks ago now. And what it does is it allows packaging of entirely new functionality that's going to sit on top of NetBox. So kind of like that same concept of like, I'm going to write a script or I'm going to write a custom, report, but I'm going to have that sit inside of the NetBox platform and have it run it for me. So you do get a lot of free infrastructure when you do this. And you get to interact with the existing components of NetBox when you write plugins. That was the whole point. But the idea here is we've exposed very specific APIs. It's an API framework so that plugin developers can make use of existing, NetBox technologies or tie into certain parts of the UI or other parts of the system. So you can obviously create your own database models, and the term model in Django is like database tables. You can create your own views, which are how you view, data within within the application, your own REST APIs, etc. You can also extend existing primary object views. So I'll show that in a moment, but like on the device view, you can actually inject content into the device view. So if your plugin relates to devices in some way, you might have some data that you want to show alongside a device. You can do that with the plugin framework. And the whole point here, as Jeremy Stretch alluded to in the first part of the day, was that this is intended to be in a way that's reusable, but also segmented, so that you don't have to maintain your own fork of the project, which comes with significant development burden over time. You just create your own package, which is separate from NetBox altogether, but users actually install that as a part of their NetBox installation and make use of your plugin. So what can plugins do? Obviously they're very usable because we can add menu elements. So this is a plugin. I don't want to steal any thunder from Damien, but this is the plugin that he's going to talk about here in just a few minutes that Network to Code has created. But we have links, this usability of our plugin we add to the existing web UI. And then obviously, if we want to, create new data, we can have our own forms and stuff, kind of like custom scripts, but in a much more robust manner. We have list views. So this is a view, obviously if you're a heavy NetBox user, like there is no section in NetBox called onboarding tasks, but our plugin here creates one. So this is not a fork of NetBox. This is a plugin itself, which is installed on top of NetBox. So you also, as I mentioned, this is me talking about injecting into existing template files for object views. So you can add buttons to primary views. So I've got one here called offline. And the use case here is like, my plugin might have the business logic implemented under the hood that if all you did was click that button, it changed the state of the object. In this case, the device defined in the core of NetBox to be in the offline state. You didn't have to go and edit the object, change the value, and save it. You can do that all with one button there because the plugin implements it, and we gave you the ability to add that functionality directly in the UI there. And then these panels here. So again, if you're a heavy NetBox user, we've got the interfaces panel down here. These three don't exist in the core of NetBox. These were added by a plugin. They're injected at runtime by the plugin. And it's worth noting that your plugin doesn't have to do all of these things. If you don't wish to inject content into certain pages, you don't have to. There's no requirement to do that. Just simply saying that these are the abilities that your plugin can have. Plugins, as I mentioned, can also expose their own API, and again, you get that infrastructure. Also worth noting that plugins are namespaced, so all the plugin APIs will be at /API plugins and then the name of the plugin. And then we also have some special endpoints for exposing metadata, of the plugins that are installed on a system. And you can also view the same sort of information in the admin portal. So, to wrap up plugins, this is definitely a new frontier for the NetBox community. And I think, I speak for a lot of the maintainers when I say that we're very excited about what the opportunities that this framework is going to create for the community. As Jeremy mentioned, our intent is to allow the core of NetBox to really focus on what it's really good at, the core feature set that appeals to the broadest audience, but also allow natively people to create external functionalities that others can reuse or that might be specific to an organization, but without them having to go through the development burden of forking the project itself. And as Jeremy alluded to earlier, if we do identify plugins that appear to have broad appeal, then maybe we can revisit those and potentially look at making those core features. And if I put my salesman hat on, just here at the last bit, Network to Code definitely has a lot of ability in executing on this sort of thing. So we'd love to partner with anyone out there if you have a plugin idea that you'd like to make a reality. Network to Code does offer now commercial support for NetBox, and there's lots of different ways that we can do these sorts of engagements. So please feel free to reach out. That was it for me. I think I'm about 10 minutes fast. I'm a fast talker, but were there any questions I can answer now?
We've had lots of good questions pop up in the chat. I've tried to take a few of them, just so that we're not scrambling here. I'm sure there's a few more coming in. One was, does Network to Code plan to provide community-supported plugins?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So definitely, Damien is about to present one that is the first one that we are open sourcing. I won't steal his thunder on that. I'll let him explain that. But definitely, our intention is to have some plugins that we want to expose to the community.
And there's another question that I had answered in the chat, but just for anyone who hadn't seen it, one question was, are we planning to establish a community-oriented repo of plugins? And I said probably not a specific repository, but for any plugins that seem to become very popular and mature enough in the community, by all means, we're interested in adopting those into the NetBox community GitHub organization. So that's the same GitHub org that houses NetBox itself, NetBox Docker, the device type library, a whole bunch of stuff in there. So we're very interested in that. And by all means, it's not to say that it has to be hosted there, but as part of, in the interest of establishing a more centralized collection of these plugins that are valuable to many people, certainly that's something that we're open to. But like John mentioned, plugins themselves are very new. It just came out in 2.8, maybe last month, I think. So a lot of people are still kind of getting their heads around it. A lot of people are experimenting with it, finding out what works, what doesn't. Um, Along that same vein, we're also still evaluating additional features to be implemented for plugins. There's a couple open feature requests now as far as the API. What changes will 2.9 and 2.10 bring down the road. So it's still a lot up in the air, but we definitely foresee some measure of semi-official plugins, I guess you would call them.
I see one here. There was a question. Can you do conditional dynamic links? So custom links, the name for that feature. An example, I want to link the web GUI, the web UI for my Cisco, but not for Cisco routers. Yes, so you can put conditional logic in the template for a link, and basically, if the template does not produce any content, i.e., you could wrap it in an if-else statement. If it doesn't produce any content, then the link won't be rendered for that particular object. So that is possible. There's a question on how best to develop reports. So we do have there's some docs on the read the docs for NetBox that talk about this. So right now, the way that you would do this is there's a local reports directory, and that is configurable in the settings as to where that directory sits. And if you follow the docs, there's some boilerplate that I showed there. You can copy and paste that, from the slide later, and you just dump it into a file of your choosing. You get to choose what you want to name that file. It just has to be a Python file, so it can be, myreports.py, and you dump that report content in there. And then you restart NetBox, and it'll show up in the reports UI. So as far as developing reports over time, what I can suggest is you can install NetBox on your local machine. That would be like a local development environment if you're doing a lot of that. You can also just go back and forth with your install of NetBox. If a report fails to run, that's not going to cause NetBox itself to crash, or at least in the vast majority of cases it shouldn't. If it does, please file a bug report. um, yeah. If that's the best answer to your question, but so when writing export templates, where can we find the object models for generating output? Yeah, it's actually a good question. So um, the model API in NetBox is kind of like this pseudo official interface that we have. But basically, the best thing I can suggest is to actually go dig into the code base itself, because that's going to be the authoritative source of what fields do and do not exist on any particular model. So NetBox the code base itself is broken up into several different applications. So there's the DCIM application, the IPAM application, the virtualization application, and so forth. And in there, there's a models, either a file called models or a directory called models in different cases that will have all those model definitions in there. The other thing I can suggest is CSV exports are another good way to see the fields that exist on a particular model. If you just do like a CSV export of like one particular instance, you can see a lot of the fields that exist there.
I think we've got time at this point for maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll hand it off to Damien.
Yeah, actually, hi guys. Tyler has, I think, a really good question. He's asking if it's possible to reuse existing Django plugin to be integrated within the new plugin frameworks, or will that require some plugin code change?
Um, yes. So I'm trying to remember what the interface for that looks like.
It depends. Is that
Yeah.
is that the answer?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you can certainly, make use of them in your plugin. I don't believe we have actually at this point exposed the interface to install other Django apps into installed apps. If you play with Django, then that makes more sense. But I don't believe we've exposed that. But correct me if I'm wrong on that, Jeremy. I don't quite remember.
Not at this point. I mean, you get into some nitty gritty details there that are probably best served through a more detailed discussion. If it's something to raise as a feature request, again, like I said, we're always reevaluating what makes sense to extend with as far as the framework is considered or involved.
And actually, that is a good point, to mention that the plugins framework is officially considered in beta status right now. It's a fairly stable interface, but it is beta at this point, so definitely some room to grow as far as what we are and are not going to support on it. Yeah, there's quite a few more questions, but I will try and answer them via the chat.